of it is mentally it's a museum, but also in terms of how the city appears to you. And in a way, this was a special point. This is still the special point in Berlin, that you have east and west with different architectures, and that kind of this gives attention to the city, and still it does. Even so, now every politician dreams of the center, which is the museum's island, and you have the new castle and so on. So that everyone dreams in a very, let's say, anachronistical way of a new center within the city, which is also like more a museum then. If you rebuild a castle, I don't know what it is than a museum. In terms of why do you do that? I mean, you demolished a certain type of architecture from the GDR, which had a strong political meaning, but it was the first thing which was actually decided right after the reunification that this is gonna disappear. And this is a political statement. But then you rebuild a castle, which is completely anachronistical. But again, it is the dream to become like this new old European center.
What I think is that, you know, there's places where the party is still going on, and there's places where the party's over.
But actually, can I ask, well, maybe also from the audience, because as I'm not from Mexico City, obviously, what would be the value if we would now find out on this panel, yes, Mexico City is the new Berlin? Just in the...
I don't know, yeah, I actually was thinking about that this morning. I mean, given that we're doing this panel. I mean, because it's funny, because every time, when I have friends who've like recently moved here, and every time I hear about another artist coming here, or a curator or a professional, I'm pretty happy. You know, I think great, the more the merrier, you know, more outside influence. But at the same time, I don't think it will become the new Berlin. I mean, for the simple reason of distance, you know? And I think another thing that Pedro just touched upon, actually, with regard to Berlin, is that, like this is one difference for me, I think, in my experience in Mexico City, is that Berlin is like, it's like a bohemian wonderland, you know? I've heard people talk about Berlin, like, young artists go to retire in Berlin. Like, they just basically go to Berghain, you know? Where it's like, it's just like, it's a big party town. Like, it's sure, there are thousands of artists, but I think it's hard to meet serious artists, you know? I think you can, whereas in Mexico City, I don't think it has the same kind of reputation. I'm not sure exactly what that reputation is, but it's for me, it's like, there's no Berghain. Berghain, in case you don't know what that is, it's a club. It's a very famous club in Berlin where people go party for like 3 days straight. And sometimes they'll start partying at like 8 in the morning. It's not like this nighttime thing. I feel like for me, in some ways, it's very emblematic of the city.
Yeah, maybe I will leave my comment and take over to you.
I have a question for the panel. So if Mexico is definitely not the next Berlin, what is the place of Mexico City in the contemporary art scene?
Who would like to answer that question?
I don't know that that's a tough question. I think that's, I mean, it's interesting because Mexico City has always, I think historically, I get the sense that it's always been a kind of crossroads, right? Like it's kind of the crossroads between North America and Latin America. I mean, although Mexico's in North America, but it's still part of Latin America. And you've had everyone from Trotsky to Roberto Bolaño to different artists and writers. It's funny, historically, artistically, it has this kind of marginal reputation in a way. But I think it's kind of always changing, you know? I feel like it's always in the process of defining itself. It's not something that's kind of fixed. And maybe I think that's kind of a good thing, because I think Berlin is, personally, I think it's kind of played out. Like, it's kind of, the energy is kind of, I don't know, I mean, there's still interesting things happening there with regard to post-internet and whatnot, but at the same time, it doesn't have the kind of raw, exciting energy it had even 5 years ago. Whereas I think the kind of amorphous quality of Mexico is somehow, there's still a kind of raw potential here, despite the development of the infrastructure.
Well, I mean, I think that what I was making strange faces, and I think that I don't know, like seeing the development of the scene in the last 15 years, there's the many things that are happening today that we would never dream. You know, like I remember, you know, like when you know, you couldn't. 15 years ago, no one would think that you could sell an installation, or that you could have an art fair, or that you could have like international shows coming. Everything was like really very, very different. And also museums had like a very conservative program. So that was why alternative spaces emerged. Now I don't, now you know, like the role of the alternative space has changed. And you know, because there's also all these other spaces that have these very good programs. So in that sense, that has not only changed the kind of dynamics inside the city, but also outside the city. Perhaps, you know, like now having a show in Mexico for a foreigner, I mean, like 15 years ago, like having a show in Mexico was like very exotic, and no one would notice, and no one would, but there was like also like the pre-internet era. And now, you know, like now it's an art capital, no? So the fact that it's an art capital plays a role in a kind of a wider dynamic, and this is kind of recent answering your question. You know, I think that's the kind of sort of if you ask what is the kind of role in Mexico in a wider, also, you know, like but there are many things that there still have to develop. I think that the collector base is relatively small and should grow, and also the galleries. It's surprising how few galleries are. You know, like for the amount of institutions and artists that are, really like there's like still a lot of growth that needs to happen in the market, in the local market, I believe.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is for Chris. What was the conclusion in that seminar about having or not a Mexico City Biennial? Instead of why, if there was any conclusion. And also, I mean, I think statistics and comparison, both in politics, economy, geography, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, we all sort of know what the differences are between Europe and Mexico, which are huge. But perhaps the comparison comes from a place where there is a lot of turmoil and there is a lot of excitement and attention given, particularly to Mexico City as a bridge between Latin America and the US. So what are certain strategies that could be incorporated into fixing certain deficits that we have to make it a more solid art scene?
To answer your question, yeah, I guess in the end we thought through the question of potential biennial here, and we developed a model, like what could be like potentially good model. And it's funny, like in the end, like thinking through this question of like what would a Mexico City biennial look like, it seemed like another way of generating energy and generating dialogue. And I think also another thing that came up was the possibility of like a better or a larger art school, right? I feel like that's, in some ways, although it's quite different, you know, to have an art school and a biennial, but in terms of exposure, generating energy, these seem kind of necessary, let's say. But Yeah, and that was a really interesting discussion, which Patricia Sloan, local curator, was involved in that. And as far as I know, there is discussion about a Mexico City triennial in the works among a certain group of people, but I haven't heard anything about it in a long time.
Maybe just, I don't know, but for me, I see it as a chance that you were describing how the situation was open. And I think, for example, especially when you talk about Europe, and this is maybe you can't compare, but it is, you're standing in a long tradition of a bourgeois model as the artist, the idea of the artist is a very bourgeois model. So, and then, I mean, in Europe, it's maybe, I don't know, did the discussion here that well, but it is very much related to the history of the bourgeoisie and the way how, and so for me, why I brought up some statistics is because I think it is important. I don't like to hype about Berlin, about the creative energy, if I'm not talking about the condition, if I'm not talking about an income, if I'm not talking about the real phase of artistic labor. And that's why I also mentioned the model of the factories, because this means a change in artistic labor. Okay, we could go back to the Renaissance, where there was like big painters like Tizian, they all had their factory. You all know that. But still, it is a very important point if you look back, and or if you look, especially also to your question, because I'm not so sure anymore about the EasyJet flights. I mean, they changed the city completely in terms of tourists. So this makes Berlin really crazy in the summer. It's like in Barcelona, where they have now British policemen because of the young British who come to party. So, but what I think is that there's only a happy few. And a lot of those, what we describe as a kind of creative energy, is part of the dark matter. I would call it a dark matter, and it's not clear how long or how far they will participate in that, in terms of those conditions we have. And if you look, I mean, if you look at the oligarchs and the way how artists are already involved in these systems, in terms of money, then I think there is a shift coming up. That's how I feel about it. Besides it, of course, there's still a lot of energy in the world, creative energies in great places like Mexico City, but still there is also a shift in a way, if you look, who still participates in terms of money.
I think that one of the most interesting things that could happen to Mexico would be a deeper involvement of artists in improving the city. You know, there are cities that are beautiful, and that there's like not much work you can do to improve. You know, like because they are, you know, because actually there's like a lot of state investment on having good mobility, good maintenance of monuments, etc. But I believe that artists in Mexico could really help to improve the city. And this is part of a tradition where, you know, like artists have participated in doing educational, running like, for instance, like education programs or designing public spaces or, you know, like creating works that in the end become part of the cultural heritage that have really became like the cultural capital of the city. So I believe that actually I have always dreamt of a biennial, or that instead of you shipping works from outside and paying shipping and insurance and etc., that artists are invited to, you know, like make permanent improvements in the city, and that stay. You know, I think that could be like an interesting model instead of temporary interventions, something that could, you know, have a lasting influence. But I believe that you know, like perhaps in my last commentary I was like, okay, well, yes, there has to be like a more, like there's potential for the market to grow, and that, you know, but just like having more galleries and more like market is not, that is something that should happen, but on the same side that is the kind of art as a commodity. I believe that also artists could make a real difference, creating new audiences, reaching out to other kind of neighborhoods and improving public spaces and other kind of situations that have to do with health, I mean, like, I'm thinking, for instance, in things like what Toro Lab is doing in Tijuana, you know? These kind of interventions that have like important effect in the fabric of a city. I think that artists in Mexico should like recover that kind of tradition and have like a stronger commitment towards the non-art world.
I'm remembering that a few years ago in a symposium that is still organized in Mexico City. It's called the International Symposium of Theory of Contemporary Art. There was a main issue that was part of the an important part of the discussion, and they were talking about centers of mainstream in art and the peripheries. So I would like to know I think one of the most interesting issues for me here would be how is art produced in Mexico seen elsewhere? Like, I think that would be like one of the main issues that would detect if Mexico is becoming like a mainstream center or not at all. Are we still like in the periphery? I mean, in art production.
Maybe I can answer a little bit and then you move on. In my opinion, obviously there are certain figures, Mexican artists that are totally present in the outside market. Gabriel Orozco, Carlos Morales, Ortega. You have a number of, let's say, blockbusters who also work with huge galleries abroad and who are, I mean, the Gabriel Orozco show in Tate Modern, you know, a couple of years ago. These are huge, huge exhibitions, and there are these, I would say, maybe 5 to 10 Mexican blockbusters roundabout outside there in the international market, but also in the institutional scene. What I do think, though, is that in fact there are many others who are operating and producing here in Mexico who are still completely invisible, and I think this is in fact something that should be improved, which is also, I think, a work of galleries, in fact, because of course, you know, if you have a powerful gallery in your back, that creates certain visibility outside. But in fact, I'm thinking that there should be also other mechanisms which should improve this visibility factor. For example, residency programs. This is something that I've been completely missing here in Mexico City, because I don't think there's actually an existing, there's SOMA, of course, but I think there could be many more, or should be many more opportunities for a proper exchange for young Mexican artists to be able to go abroad, and thus, of course, also offering and getting exposure there. And on the other hand, also for young European or, you know, just young artists from abroad to come in and work here, because there is, what I do realize, that there is a huge interest in Mexico City. There are so many young artists coming over here on research trips. Right now there are at least, I think, 5 of them here working for new projects to come, and I think this is something that should be facilitated in the future.
Just to add really quickly, I totally agree. I don't think it's just in terms of like my experience of being an outsider, and there, in addition to these market artists like Gabriel Orozco, Damian Ortega, so on and so forth, there is a tradition of this political and socially engaged kind of Mexican and Latin American artists, such as Teresa Margolles or Minerva Cuevas, these kind of artists that I think really respond to a certain set of expectations in Latin America and the rest of the world. So it's not just that, but there's, I think, these kind of 2 different sides.
Would you say that they are like leading artists? Can Mexico be like propositive, you know?
Yeah, in terms of, I mean, it's really hard because artists like Gabriel Orozco, for instance, he's really responding to a kind of European tradition of modernism, which you find like in Brazil, and I think that's one of the reasons